Hi everyone, welcome back to another MU518 video. In this one we are going to talk about an article by Blair Johnston called Between Romanticism and Modernism and Post-Modernism, George Crumb's Black Angels. So we're continuing our Black Angels deep dive this week, and you'll notice that this article is also from Music Theory Online, where I've taken a lot of our articles from this semester, and it's from June 2012, so it's almost 10 years old. Blair Johnston is a music theorist who was a postdoc when I was a master's student at Indiana, and at least for a time, he was an associate professor there. I can't find him on their website right now, and I can't find him anywhere else on the internet listed as someone else's faculty member, so I'm a little confused by that. He was teaching at Indiana, and I think it's likely that he still is. He went to University of Michigan and got his PhD, and I think he taught there as a graduate student and then probably just briefly after his degree was finished. This title of this article plays on words with this title, which is from an article by Catherine Lasada. He cites her and discusses her work a bit when he talks about parody and collage and illusion, etc. And this article that he's playing on is called Between Modernism and Post-Modernism, Strands of Continuity and Collage Compositions by Rochberg, Berrio, and Zimmerman. And so he's using some of the same analytical techniques, and he's applying them to this work by Crumb. And his title is Between Romanticism and Modernism and Postmodernism, and we get Black Angels. Here are some of the words that he lists as keywords. Quotation, as in taking music from another composition or an existing composition and quoting it, and usually citing that quotation somewhere on the score. Pastiche, which would be more like a collage, like you would combine several different quotations together, maybe an illusion and maybe newly composed music, but maybe not. Teleological genesis. Teleological is a good word for you to know, and what it means for the purposes of this class is goal-oriented. Teleological has the same root word as telescope, telos, and telos usually refers to having an end orientation or having some kind of goal for the shape of a story arc or similar situation. So teleological genesis might mean where the telos comes from, or what gives something a sense of being teleological. Romanticism is probably a familiar word to you. Postmodernism we have talked about a bit in some of our other readings. But with postmodernism, we're really talking about socio-cultural movement and an artistic movement that would have begun in the late 60s, early 70s. And for me, is a defining feature of Crumb's music that he has access and feels that he has access to all previous historical music and other cultures' music as well. Catherine Lasada is who that is. Richard Bass, here I'll highlight his name by itself. Richard Bass is a music theorist who has done a lot of very structural analyses of Crumb and has done a lot of defending him from criticism that his music is just like superficial sound effects. Darcy and Hepikoski, usually said the other way around, are two music theorists who study sonata form and in a really experiential and kind of deep dive way. So I don't mean that they just like analyze sonatas. They have like theories of sonata form that are probably a little bit different than the one that you were taught in undergrad. And then lastly, Crumb, who by this point I feel like you know fairly well. You can look at his abstract to get a sense of this article. Blair has a really good sense of humor, and I really like this opening. The title of this essay is Prepositionally Reprehensible. Between Romanticism and Modernism and Postmodernism. But as he says, I mean to play on the title of a recent article by Catherine Lasada in order to highlight a defining feature of George Crumb's electric string quartet, Black Angels. Crumb's reimagining in a stylistically eclectic manner that is similar in certain ways to the works Lasada discusses of a musical plot archetype closely associated with 19th century Romanticism and the 19th century symphony in particular. So he just is full of thesis statement material right up front. I will present Black Angels against the backdrop of what William Darcy has called the drive toward a metaphysical Erlösung, the victory through struggle paradigm so important to the 19th century symphony, where an initially troubling beginning is ultimately redeemed, or in some cases, dramatically fails to be redeemed. So let's stop for a moment. Erlösung, I actually put on your handout. These are the words that came up when I looked it up in my Leo online dictionary of German to English. Deliverance, redemption, salvation, maybe a desire for those things, achieved for the hero, and I could also add like, or not achieved, at the end of a plot. So Darcy is interested in how a symphonic form, and that remember that symphonic form is like sonata form, how it would achieve or not achieve those same things and have a dramatic meaning in a piece of classical music. Blair, Johnston, is really interested in how those things happen in Black Angels, and he especially focuses on two of the what he calls interior movements. He spends a lot of time looking at God music and the devil music. Part of what's interesting about this article is that he's talking about how much Crumb is interested in earlier music. He's really into classical and romantic music. I think Crumb was really in love with the classical canon in a lot of ways. I think he loved a lot of that music deeply, and so that's, I think, where the impulse comes for him to quote it. Crumb, he says, has called this, in his liner notes, a Vietnam-era voyage of the soul. You know my thoughts about that because I've already talked about them in another video that I made for you, and you'll see more in my video about the Library of Congress materials. And this is just sort of an overview of Black Angels. One goes into the piece anticipating its engagement with the Erlösung paradigm and having Darcy's comments in mind. One might even say Black Angels has a certain symphonic character. Now that I do get, because I think this piece is so involved, the scope of it and its poetic stakes are so high, the scope is so big, the sound is big, it's amplified, and it involves a lot more instruments than just a string quartet. I can definitely see how you would think of that as being symphonic in character. Anyway, he gives some preliminaries about the piece, about his analysis. The idea is that the quartet has symmetry in its structure in that palindrome, and also a sense of telos. We both have a sense of it being like, symmetry can sometimes feel cyclical or circular in that, the end-6 are turned at the end, for example. But it also has a sort of left to right structure and kind of arc of progress. So those things together are how he wants to analyze this piece. Part of what Lasada writes about just in general is this idea of postmodern collage and chromatic complementation. The idea there is that you can combine a bunch of different things together and it will achieve this sort of climactic fullness that comes as a culmination of the combination of all those things. And she also is more specific about what stylistic allusion and parody mean in 20th century music. So then he divides the rest of the article. He has these like 3 main sections: culmination, quotation, and compromise. And in culmination, he focuses on God music, the movement with the cello solo and the crystal glasses, and how its features are different from the rest of the quartet, for example, because it is almost tonal. It's very triadic and consonant. It's in B major. B is in Bravo major. He touches on the fact that there's different whole tone scales and different octatonic scales and interval vectors. And I want to just review what those concepts are for a moment. So here's a quick refresher in case you have forgotten things about the octatonic scale. And these are all octatonic. And when I'm saying that word, what I mean is octatonic. We label this one 0, 1, comma 1, because those are the first 2 pitches. And one thing that's interesting about the octatonic scale is that it's only one set class, because you can put all of these in prime form and find their set class identity and they'll all be the same. However, depending on what note you start on, we give them slightly different names. So this one, remember that an octatonic is an alternation of half steps and whole steps, etc., until you get back up. The next one here would be C, and we've already done that. So there's another way you can start that. Here's one where you would start it based on C up to C sharp, You get a slightly different collection of pitches if you start on C sharp. And so we call that one octatonic 1, 2 to show that it starts on 1 and goes to 2. Notice that, again, you get a slightly different collection of pitches in that F natural is in this one and not F sharp. It's the same set class, but not the same set. So it has the same intervals and all of that, but it has a slightly different collection of actual pitches. Like there's no B natural over here. And so we give it a slightly different name. And finally, the third kind. There are only 3 of these that you can make uniquely that will have some overlapping pitches, but will have some unique pitches. There's only 3 of them, and partially that's because the scale is so symmetrical that it starts to repeat itself if you start over again. Like if you start the scale on D sharp, you'll end up with this collection again. Octatonic, and this one is called 2, 3. And remember that these numbers, 0, 1, refer to the first 2 pitches here. This is 0, C sharp is 1, or here, 1, 2, C sharp is 1, D natural is 2. Here, octatonic 2, 3, we've got 2 is D natural and 3 is D sharp. The same logic applies to the whole tone collection. There's only one set class for the whole tone collection. And it's a hexachord of 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, T. However, in terms of which pitches we actually put in it, we can have 2 different versions of it with 2 different sets of pitch classes. So here's one. This is whole tone. And in this case, it's whole tone 0 because it contains the note C, and C is 0. Notice that these have the same intervals, the same interval pattern, but this one is just a version of it that starts on C sharp. So this is whole tone 1. And there's only 2 versions of that scale because they're hexachords. They're complementary in that if you take this one, all the notes that are not in it are over here, and vice versa. All together, you have all 12 pitches stated, so it's a popular scale for composers who write atonal music to choose. It's an easy, using the whole tone scale can be an easy way to organize pitch content in a whole tone, or in an atonal piece that's not necessarily 12 tone. The last set theory concept I want to review with you is the interval vector. An interval vector is a way of keeping track of which intervals are present in a given set class. I could even have done this vertically, so here's a way to do that. C, and then the next note would be, let's make it D flat, just to make it easier to notate, and then E. They're the same set class. C, C sharp E, C, D flat E. And I'll go ahead and tell you, since this is written the way that it is, that its prime form is going to be 0, 1, 4. Because C is 0, C sharp is 1, and E is 4. And I'm doing that also to show you just picking a relatively simple trichord so that we can look at what an interval vector is when there's just a limited number of notes. So an interval vector keeps track of the first 6 intervals as a way of finding the interval content of a given set class. So here, and I often use these angle brackets to identify them. Go in order of the intervals, starting with a half step and working our way up to a tritone. So the question is, in 014, how many half steps are there? You can find that out by looking at the score. Like there's one, but this is not one. And E back up to C is not one. Or you can also look at the numbers and say, where is there an instance of 1? Like 0 and 1, there's only 1 in between them. But from 1 to 4 is more. So anyway, there's 1 half step. How many whole steps are there? Or are there any? The answer is there are none. So you would put a 0 there. And you just know from the number of intervals that we have to choose from that that is the whole step column. The next one would be minor thirds. How many minor thirds are there in this set class? Well, that's an interval of 3, right? So we're going to look at, where is there a 3 between these numbers? Well, between 1 and 4 is 3. So there's 1. Are there any others? Well, from 0 up to 4 is 4. From E up to C or E down to C is too many. There's 1 minor third. Are there any major thirds? Well, I just told you there's one of them. From 0 to 4 is a minor third. And that's 1 there. And then, are there any other major thirds? From C up to E. And you might be wondering, from E up to C is a minor sixth, but we actually just keep everything a tritone or smaller. So we would take, from a minor sixth, we would take its inversion, which is a major third, and just count it like that. Then, are there any perfect fourths? No. Perfect fifths would also be inverted to count as perfect fourths, and I don't see any of those. And then the last one is the tritone. Are there any tritones in this set class? No. And so that's the interval vector for this entire set class. And that's how you would do that for a set class of any size. I just wanted to review that in case you couldn't remember what an interval vector is. Culmination, I wanted to make sure that you understood the types of scales and what interval vectors were, things that are being discussed in the context of God music. And later, I misspoke before, I believe he talks about the Pavana more than he talks about devil music, but devil music also comes up in the piece. So anyway, in the quotation section, he focuses on the Schubert quotation in the Pavana movement, which we've discussed just a little bit, and combining that with the insect sound that shows up in that movement. It's interesting to think about the kind of changes that Johnston identifies in that movement, because he says he doesn't just quote Schubert, he also makes a couple of harmonic alterations, like omitting the third, such that it just sounds more hollow and less harmonically defined and a little bit more creepy, I would say. I'm not totally sure in the next section if Johnston is correct that the Ancient Voices movements in Black Angels are references to Crum's own piece, Ancient Voices of Children, because Ancient Voices of Children was written in 1970. But I also think from his sketches that he was probably thinking about the concept of Ancient Voices and Ancient Voices of Children and that piece at the same time that he was also finishing Black Angels. So I don't think that those things are like out of the realm of possibility, but I don't think it's necessarily a one-to-one relationship. And then he discusses narratively how the piece changes after God music and after the climax, which Crum identifies as the central Black Angels movement, and Blair identifies as the God music movement, because after that things sort of unravel in terms of the sort of narrative content of the piece. Like the end of the piece is a goal, but it's not a point of rest like you would assume would happen at the end of a symphony. He feels that when things return, like the insects or the sarabanda or whatever, when they return in later movements of Black Angels, that they are different in a way because of having gone past that central climactic movement, and that they're changed somehow, which is an interesting narrative concept to think about. For my discussion questions, I'd like you to think about whether you find his teleological Erlösung structure or the symmetrical kind of arrangement that Crum presents of the movements to be more compelling, or perhaps both of them at the same time, or maybe you don't really feel compelled by either one. And in my second question, I ask you to name another piece that includes collage, parody, quotation, and or allusion, and how is it different from the way Crum uses those things? And finally, how does Crum's musical reality change how the quotations and allusions are heard? And you can look at paragraph number 14 if you want more context for what I'm talking about there in terms of reality against which the quotations appear. And that's all for now. So have a great week, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye.